Crimes Against Health, Safety, and the Environment. Module 4, Readings Part 1. Generally, using criminal law to stop environmental and consumer harm to people is a relatively new thing in modern society. One thing that happened is new technology brought progress, but also new kinds of extended harm, including increases in synthetic poisons injected broadly into the environment. What's been true is it often takes a singular catastrophe to move legislators to penalize these kinds of conditions. One thing that happened way back was Franklin Roosevelt installed Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president, as head of the SEC. He did so with the observation that you have to set a thief to catch a thief. Yet, unfortunately, too many regulators today are too close to the industries they regulate, and the thieves are often trading back and forth into government positions. Let's talk about examples of corporate violence, since much of what we're going to be talking about are harms that maimed or even killed large numbers of people, often much larger than the typical crimes of violence we might hear about in the news. You have sale of unfit goods, such as the drug thalidomide, which in the 50s caused irreparable damage to fetuses and children that were born. You had provision of unfit services, trains which crash, aircraft in which we breathe polluted air or suffer illness as a result of inadequate legroom. False or illegal labeling or information, often where you endanger health when household cleaning products are improperly used, for example. Fraudulent safety devices or failure to test products. And then you have broad crimes against worker health and safety, where the people producing the products we consume are themselves injured in the process. And most broadly, we have crimes against the environment. Hazardous waste dumping in fields and in water, illegal emissions to the air, to the water and land. One of the most famous, iconic disasters was Love Canal. This had been an old site, dumping ground for chemical companies from the 1920s through 1953. After the site was shut down, it was covered up, and 100 homes were built on the site where the dumping had occurred before, along with an elementary school. The families began to smell chemical odors from their basements, with heavy vapors coming in. They started to observe large-scale numbers of spontaneous abortions, birth defects. The company Occidental, which had bought Hooker Chemical, which was a key dumper of 20,000 tons of waste on the site, agreed to pay $98 million for cleanup of the site. But with so many similar sites around the country, often with unknown dumpers, Love Canal sparked a focus on passage of what became called the Superfund Law, with a budget to locate and repair the damage caused by hazardous waste conditions across the country that were similar to Love Canal. Originally, it was supposed to be funded by the polluters themselves across the country, but in 2003, Congress decided the polluting companies would no longer foot the bill, would be part of general revenue to pay for it. Another iconic disaster was the Exxon Valdez tanker. It was an accident in Alaska. The tanker spilled 11 million gallons of oil after hitting icebergs, contaminating water, beaches, killing marine and bird life. There was indication of drinking by the captain, although no legal judgment on that score. Exxon itself faced a civil judgment of $1.1 billion and a criminal fine of just $12.5 million. In response, Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. It toughened the roster of white-collar crimes associated with oil pollution, increased the maximum penalties for failure to notify federal agencies when there were discharges of oil, and created a maximum jail term, moving it from 1 year up to 5 years. More broadly, we've seen with the EPA, with its 2010 criminal enforcement program, you see the scope of what is done. That program defined criminal enforcement program as focused on, quote, negligent, knowing, or willful violations of federal environmental law, when the violator is aware that the wrongful conduct is prohibited under the law and the violation is said to be willful, and often finds other crimes such as lying to the government, fraud, or conspiracy. Some examples that were cited: company directs employees to bypass facilities' wastewater treatment to avoid having to purchase the chemicals needed to run a wastewater treatment unit. You have a building owner who hires a contractor to fix a ceiling, but they save money by not dealing with asbestos removal. Of course, illegal discharge of pollutants, disposal of hazardous waste, and often money laundering that's often related to environmental crime activities. It's worth talking about Ralph Nader and the rise of the consumer movement more generally back in the 1960s and into the 1970s. Nader, as an advocate, was one of those who wanted to emphasize violence most clearly in corporate actions, trying to reframe what were often treated as accidents as acts of violence. As he'd say, there's no full escape from violent ingestion, for breathing's required. He talked about damage that shatters people's health and safety. But he noted most environmental damage is not included in crime statistics. And he wanted to talk about smogging a city or town, much analogy to mugging, arguing that we should worry as much about the smoggers as the muggers. Interestingly, Nader got the money to start many of the groups that launched the environmental and consumer movement because he wrote a book about auto safety called Unsafe at Any Speed. General Motors hired private investigators to try to frame him with sordid details and even tried to set him up with a prostitute. Having failed, Nader caught them and won, at this point, $284,000, which in those days was quite a lot of money, enough to set up a number of different groups based on what was seen as overzealous surveillance. Let's talk about corporate violence against workers. For most of history, employers were not held liable for deaths, injuries, or illnesses suffered by workers as a consequence of workplace conditions. Now that the estimate is some 3.6 million workers annually in the US suffer some significant occupational accident or disease. Around the world, the International Labor Organization estimates 2 million work-related deaths and 160 million new work-related disease worldwide. But these are estimates because there's really no good compilation and definitive source of statistics here. So much of it goes unreported. And once environmental and other restrictions were put in place on workplaces, production could be moved overseas to developing countries to escape the regulation that was in place, lowering costs, but also escaping statistical study and liability. In the Steve Coombs book, he notes, why is corporate crimes of violence largely absent from law and order agendas by politicians? He notes that when you look at various enforcement agencies, how they spend their money, and in the political rhetoric of crime and law and order, corporate crimes are largely marginalized. Law tends to operate quite differently with respect to corporate crime than in the context of conventional crimes. And most forms of corporate and organizational legal offenses are relatively decriminalized. There may be fines, but very few penalties sending people to prison. And where business organizations engage in criminal activities, It's usually represented as an aberration from their routine legitimate activities, usually treated as technical infringements of the law rather than real crimes. And of course, on television, far more focus on the telegenic violent crime than the slow seeping, crimes of disease and violence and workplace order that just doesn't show up on TV in the same way. You have to note the poverty and paucity of official corporate crime data. Measures used to indicate the scale of the crime problem just almost never include corporate offenses. Even the official measurements of death at work are largely unreliable. Your texts talk about the problems of measuring asbestos-related deaths, the hard to count, the slow deaths that happen over years, and the exact cause, the exact source of death is often hard to exactly pinpoint, making it often an undisguised sort of crime rate. Here's the thing. Victims of corporate violence often don't recognize or identify culprits. So its crime is identified when a victim calls the police. It doesn't happen as much in the case of environmental and consumer crimes. That lack of awareness means that people often don't recognize that they're a victim of a type of legal offense. They get sick at work and don't think of illegality on the part of their employer. And there's often the vision of the accident-prone worker that the workers will often put the blame on themselves, even without recognizing the lack of safety protections that were in the workplace that made the accident almost inevitable. If a child suffers from breathing difficulties, often won't blame it on the local environment. Or even if they do, they won't see it as a crime by the local factory. And even informed understandings of the problem will still mean that there are difficulties in getting redress. There's a disincentive against reporting corporate crime or acting given the complexity of rooting it out. So you end up with a focus on individual harm, individual causation, and not always on the causal line between violence observed and the social systems that promote pollution, unsafe work conditions. All of those connections are often unclear and under-discussed. In your Tombs reading, he notes that beyond trying to find individual liability, you really need to think about systematic solutions to corporate violence, given how widespread and diffuse the problem often is. You have to think about how does the size and scope of a particular market that has large amounts of workplace violence or pollution, how does that impact public harm? And you have to recognize corporate violence is often a rational decision by corporations seeking to maximize profits. The big problem is you have, as he says, quote, under-regulation and an absence of corporate crime controls appears to be as much an embedded feature of capitalist social orders as corporate crime itself. So the alternative to just trying to ramp up criminal sanctions is to think about, quote, alternative means of organizing production regimes that will neither encourage nor sustain the routine killings, injury, and impoverishment of lives wrecked by corporations. So that's the question, is how do you think about both the individual liability, how do you pull in new statistics to measure the problem, and beyond trying to arrest or imprison everybody in sight that might have caused the problems, can you change the systems of production that produce the overall problem in the first place?